I'm sure many of you this time of year will have been on holiday, and one of the least reassuring things to hear as you set off on holiday is the pilot of the aircraft saying, "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is my first time doing this." Well, this is the first time I've had the privilege of preaching, so you have a couple of the same options as on the plane with the novice pilot. Have a little snooze and hope it all turns out okay, or check that I'm following the instructions. So please do follow 1 Thessalonians 3:11 to 4:12, and that's on page 1122 in the Bibles. And let's just pray briefly. Father, thank you for your word, and help us to understand what you want to hear from it this morning. I want to focus briefly on 4 things the passage seems to be talking about, and hopefully we find encouragement in all of them. Loving and praying for one another, sexual immorality, what Tom Wright helpfully translates rather than brotherly love as charitable love for the whole family, and living in the light of the second coming. We could probably have a sermon series on each of those 4, but we're just going to touch on each of them and hopefully have some food for thought and prayer later. First of all, loving and praying for one another. Most of you might know that I'm a school teacher, and when we're writing reports as teachers, we're always encouraged to give areas for development and improvement, however well a student is doing. And I do sometimes feel sorry for the ones who are already working really hard and achieving very well, and we seem to be saying, work even harder. And here, the Thessalonians were a very, very young church, and some of what I read last week suggests even just a year old since St. Paul's first visit to them, seem to be doing pretty well already. Chapter 1, verse 7 says, "You became a model to all believers." So perhaps the naughty Corinthians could have learned something from the church of the Thessalonians. And chapter 3, verse 8 acknowledges their standing firm in the Lord. And in our passage, verse 1 of chapter 4 repeats the same thing. Yet still, Paul prays that their love increases and overflows. There's always more we can be doing to please God, not least in making sure the love of the church family is not insular. I think one of the most interesting bits of this first part of the passage is a little extra in verse 12. We read at the beginning, "May the Lord make your love increase and overflow for each other and for everyone else." We should never be asking, is that person one of our tribe? Being an inclusive church must mean that we're open to anyone who comes through the door, or not being exclusive when we imagine who we might invite in. Then, just in case any of the Thessalonians wondered why, when they were perhaps already A-star students, Paul is wanting them to do more, he reminds them, in effect, in verse 13, that the way we treat each other now should increasingly look like the way we will treat each other in heaven. So one challenge for us to take away this morning is that coming to and being part of church should be like being in heaven. Now, I will admit that I was a little daunted coming to prepare this passage and seeing that a significant part of it was about sexual immorality. However, despite all the current agonizing and disagreements in the Church of England around living in love and faith and the like, there's something very clear and I think actually uncontroversial here. Uncontroversial perhaps, but as radical in our world as to the ancient Romans. We can think, I'm sure, of too many examples, both outside and inside the church, of sexual behavior which is and has been, to paraphrase Paul, exploitative and abusive of positions of power and trust. Holy living in this area clearly must be the opposite of this, mutually respectful, monogamous, and faithful. Again, when Paul starts to talk about brotherly or family love in verse 9, and if you like a bit of New Testament Greek on a Sunday morning, this is Philadelphia, love for a sibling. He returns to the pattern of acknowledging that they're on for a pretty good grade, but they could still do more. In the last church I belonged to in Aylesbury, I was in a home group where we drafted a letter St. Paul might write to us as a church, which was a very interesting exercise. If there are members of home groups here this morning, they might want to try the same thing. I'm sure that if St. Paul wrote to St. Mary's, he would be overjoyed to see many things through children's work, Dementia Cafe, warm spaces, as well as all the informal pastoral networks of support, joint efforts with other churches like the Lent course, but he would certainly challenge us to go deeper. And I'm sure that doesn't mean more activity, but how we cultivate the quality of relationships and care for each other. In fact, if we go back and look carefully at chapter 4, verse 1, he doesn't say, do more stuff, put on more events, set up more rotas. He says, please God, more and more. So it might even mean there are wrong things we should stop doing. Now, if you've been following the flight manual, you might wonder, as I mentioned at the beginning, what this passage has in fact to do with the second coming. But it is a theme that runs through the whole letter, and it's certainly still the background here. There was an expectation in many parts, if not all parts of the early church, of an imminent second coming of Jesus. And why would there not be? He'd promised that he would. And Paul does mention it explicitly at the end of chapter 3, and in much more technical language in chapter 5, coming up, I think, in the series in a couple of weeks' time. So do come back for that. And that expectation of imminence might have led early Christians to abandon ordinary day-to-day work. But verses 11 and 12 remind the Thessalonians and us that we shouldn't just retreat into a holy huddle and be perceived as being a bit weird, but keep going at whatever we are called to do day to day. This should be a real encouragement. Our daily work and the way we do it is and should be part of our living as followers of Jesus. And here, if St. Paul was writing to us in St. Mary's, or are imagining the letter he might write to us, he would want to remind us that even 2,000 years on, the second coming is still a coming reality, but his messages about praying for one another, sexual morality, loving one another, and keeping going would remain unchanged. Amen.
So our notice is, thank you, Tim, for preaching. Next week, we've got Leonie Troke, who some of you know will be preaching on the next passage of chapter 4 from 1 Thessalonians. So if you want to do your homework, read it before you come next week. There are things happening over the next couple of weeks and into September. On the 21st, so a week tomorrow, Nadine's running a special Sparklers session for preschool up to 11-year-olds from 10 till 11:30. There'll be crafts and games. There'll be coffee and cakes. Do you still need help?
I need some cakes, please.
Cakes, please, would be helpful for next week. So you can always bring them next Sunday if that's easier. And then in 2 weeks' time, on the 27th, we'll have our 10 o'clock service. There'll be a baptism in that. And then at 12 o'clock, we're going to have a barbecue. I think you may be becoming aware that Paul and I are disappearing for 3 months as I go off on sabbatical. So we're going to have a barbecue, celebrate the end of the summer, celebrate me disappearing. I don't know if there looks like there might be a list. So Julie's put up a list on the board. Can you put your name if you're coming so that we make sure that we'll buy the meat or the vegetarian options. And then it'd be lovely if you could bring a salad or a dessert to share with everybody. So please sign up for that if you're going to be around. I know it's bank holiday weekend, but hopefully people will be here. The 3rd of September is welcome tea. If anybody, there are new people here. If you haven't been invited but would like to come along, please talk to Trish and Mark, are sitting at the back there. And then on the 21st of September, the Thursday, there is a retreat day at St. Catherine's, Parmore. So chat to Nadine if you'd like to know more about that. Being able to go off. Parmore is sort of in the Hambledon Valley, sort of near Freeth. So if you would like to do that, then please have a word with Nadine then. I'm flicking through. I turned up this morning and went, the weeds have been done in the back. So our Mark, who regularly does some garden work for us, has dealt with all of those. But there are still all the weeds around the yew trees, and there's trimming to be done. If anybody sort of wakes up one day and went, well, I haven't got enough gardening to do in my own garden, but perhaps I could come and help at church, just come down. Particularly if it's weeding, just bring your fork and do a bit of weeding. It all helps. We have Harry, we have Simon, we have Tim, we pay Mark, but if we can do our bit as well, it continues to give, make it looking good. Wendover won the Best Kept Village competition. I don't know if you'd heard that. We haven't heard what the report says. In 2019, it really remarked on the churchyard. So hopefully we got a gold star for that as well. So as I say, if you can help, that would be really, really good. I think that's everything.